Just minutes ago, the streets outside Parliament erupted. Hundreds of people shouting "Traitor" at Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Police everywhere, cameras rolling, chaos breaking out. And trust me, the reason why this is happening will shock you. From welfare cuts to controversial immigration moves, we're about to break down exactly how the guy who promised change ended up facing the angriest crowd of his career. Keir Starmer's journey to becoming Prime Minister wasn't the kind of overnight success you see in movies. It was a slow climb, step by step, built on a reputation for being calm, careful, and calculated. Before politics, he had been a barrister, and later the head of the Crown Prosecution Service. That background gave him an image of someone who followed rules, knew the law inside out, and wasn't easily swayed by emotions. When he became leader of the Labour Party in 2020, it was during one of the most divided times in British politics. People saw him as a safe pair of hands after the chaos of the Brexit years. At first, his approach seemed to work. He positioned himself as a moderate, someone who wouldn't take extreme stances, someone who could bring back voters Labour had lost. He was disciplined, didn't get caught in scandals, and spoke with a measured tone. By the time the general election came in 2024, he had managed to pull Labour into a strong position. The party won, and on a sunny July day, Keir Starmer walked into Downing Street as Prime Minister. But winning an election is one thing. Keeping people happy afterwards is another. Within months, cracks began to show. Some of his own MPs started feeling that his government wasn't bold enough, while others thought he was making the wrong compromises. When welfare reforms were announced, changes that meant cuts for some benefits, things really started to heat up. These policies didn't sit well with many Labour supporters who expected the party to protect the most vulnerable. Then came more trouble. Internal disagreements spilled into the public eye. Some MPs left their roles, openly criticizing the government's direction. The media began picking apart his decisions, and headlines shifted from praising him as a disciplined leader to questioning whether he had lost touch with ordinary people. Opinion polls began to dip, showing a drop in public trust. For someone who had built his career on control and strategy, the sudden wave of public anger must have been a shock. But politics can turn fast. One month, you're the hope for change. The next, you're standing behind a wall of police while protesters scream, "Traitor," at you. On the news, you just see clips and headlines. But in person, there's this buzz in the air, like static before a storm. People aren't just there to wave signs. They've come with stories, with reasons, and most of them are boiling over.
Right at the front of the crowd, there was a man in his 50s wearing a worn-out high-vis jacket. His voice was already cracked from yelling, but he kept going. When someone asked him why he was there, he didn't waste words. "I voted for him," he said, pointing toward Parliament. "I thought he'd be different. Turns out he's just the same as the rest. Promises in, cuts out." You could see the disappointment in his face. It wasn't the kind of anger you fake. A few steps back, a younger woman, maybe in her late 20s, held a handmade sign with bold red letters, "You forgot us." She explained that she worked in social care and had already been struggling before the new welfare changes. "When they cut funding, it's not just numbers on paper," she said. "It means the people I look after don't get the help they need. And when I speak up, it's like no one listens." Her voice shook, but she didn't stop talking. It wasn't just Labour supporters out there. There were activists from other parties, students with loudspeakers, even a small group holding up placards about climate change. One of them, a guy with dreadlocks and a green scarf, said he didn't care about party lines. He cared about leaders making choices that destroy the planet and hurt people at the same time. For him, shouting "traitor" wasn't about personal hate. It was about betrayal of values he thought were shared. In the middle of all this, an older woman leaned on a walking stick, quietly watching. She didn't join the chants, but when asked, she said she had lived through enough governments to know when trust was gone. "Once people stop believing you, there's no speech in the world that can bring them back," she said, almost like a warning. When people talk about why protests like this happen, it almost always comes back to decisions made behind closed doors. In this case, a lot of the frustration was rooted in two major areas: immigration policy and welfare changes. These weren't just abstract political debates. They were the kind of policies that affect everyday lives directly. The welfare cuts hit first. The government announced adjustments to benefits,
saying it was about streamlining the system and making it fairer. On paper, it sounded like a budget fix. But in reality, it meant thousands of people receiving less money each month. For someone on a tight budget, that's not just a number going down. It's rent, food, medicine. For carers, disabled individuals, and low-income families, it felt like being told they were less important in the grand scheme of things. The problem wasn't just the cuts themselves, it was how they were rolled out. There wasn't much clear communication about who would be affected and by how much. People found out through sudden letters or changes in payments, often with little time to adjust. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. That's why some protesters outside Parliament held signs about broken promises and protect the vulnerable. To them, this was proof that the government had lost touch with the struggles of ordinary people. Then there was the immigration side. Recently, the government agreed to start publishing the names, ethnic backgrounds, and immigration statuses of people accused of certain crimes. Supporters of the move said it was about transparency, but critics argued it was playing into dangerous narratives that could lead to more division and discrimination. Activists saw it as a direct response to pressure from the far right, something they never expected from a Labour government. This policy struck a nerve because it wasn't just about paperwork. It was about identity and belonging. Immigrant communities, many of whom had lived in the UK for decades, suddenly felt targeted. Even people who weren't directly affected worried about the precedent it set. Once the government starts separating people by background and public records, what's next? For Starmer, these decisions may have been about political strategy, trying to appeal to a wider range of voters, maybe even win back those who had shifted to other parties. But in the process, he risked alienating the very base that had helped him get elected. It's like trying to fix one problem by creating two more. When the shouting outside Parliament faded, the noise inside the political world only got louder. What happened on the streets didn't stay there. It spilled straight into party meetings, TV debates, and even quiet conversations in Westminster corridors. The protest might have looked like a public outburst, but for the Labour Party, it was a flashing red warning light. Inside Labour, cracks were already showing before this protest. Over the past months, several MPs had stepped down from government positions, each giving their own reason, but all hinting at deeper problems. Some said they disagreed with welfare policies. Others criticized the immigration decisions. A few just admitted they didn't feel listened to anymore. These weren't small backbenchers with no influence. Some were big names who had helped Starmer during the election campaign. Their resignations made headlines and raised questions about whether the Prime Minister was losing control of his own team. Party meetings reportedly became tense. Loyalists argued that the government needed to hold its ground, insisting the reforms were necessary to keep the economy stable and to win over centrist voters. But critics within the party said that trying to please everyone was actually pleasing no one. They warned that Labour was at risk of alienating its core supporters, the same people who had worked tirelessly to get them into power. Meanwhile, the opposition party saw an opportunity. The Conservatives pounced on the chaos, painting Labour as divided and weak. They called the protest a sign of the public's growing disappointment and demanded the Prime Minister reverse certain policies. Smaller parties like the Liberal Democrats and the Greens used the moment to present themselves as more consistent and trustworthy alternatives. Even outside traditional politics, new movements began to grow louder. Former Labour supporters who felt betrayed started joining activist groups or looking toward independent candidates. Some linked up with Jeremy Corbyn's circle, which had been quietly building its own base of support. Others were drawn to newer political projects that promised to focus on social justice without, quote, compromising values. Public trust is a weird thing. It takes years to build, but it can vanish in a single moment. For a lot of people watching the protest outside Parliament, it wasn't just about whether they agreed with the policies or not. It was about trust. And once trust starts slipping away, everything else feels shaky. For years, Labour had built its brand on being the party of the working class, the underdog, the voice for people who didn't have much power in society. That's why Starmer's victory had felt like a turning point for so many. He was seen as someone steady, someone who wouldn't get dragged into drama, someone who could quietly get the job done. But as the months went by, people began to notice decisions that didn't match the promises they remembered hearing during the election. The welfare cuts, the immigration policy shift, those were the big headlines. But there were also smaller things that ate away at people's faith. Funding for local community centers was cut in some areas. Promises about improving NHS waiting times felt slow to materialize. Rent prices kept rising, while housing reforms seemed stuck in endless debate. These little disappointments added up, like drops of water filling a bucket. Eventually, it overflowed. When protesters shout traitor at a prime minister, it's not always about one single betrayal. It's about a collection of letdowns that make people feel like the person they voted for doesn't see them anymore. And in conversations around the country, whether in pubs, school car parks, or online forums, that's exactly what people were saying. Social media posts started to sound more personal. Instead of just debating policy, people were talking about how they felt abandoned. "I believed in him," one tweet read, "and now I feel like a fool." Another went viral after a student wrote, "We didn't vote for this version of Labour. We voted for hope." The problem for Starmer is that trust isn't like a light switch you can just flip back on. Once people stop believing you mean what you say, every future promise sounds like empty words. Even if he introduced a new policy tomorrow that genuinely helped struggling families, many would still question whether it was sincere or just damage control after the protests. When you zoom out from the chaos outside Westminster, you realize this isn't the first time a leader has faced a crowd calling them a traitor. In fact, history, both in the UK and around the world, is full of moments like this. It's almost like a political pattern. A leader rises to power on hope and promises, makes decisions they believe are necessary, and then faces a wave of backlash when the public feels those promises have been broken. One obvious UK example is Tony Blair. In the late 1990s, he was hugely popular, young, energetic, and seen as the fresh face who could modernize Britain. But after the Iraq War decision, protests filled the streets, and people who once backed him were suddenly holding signs accusing him of betraying the country. The same shift from praise to anger happened fast, and it stuck with him for the rest of his career. Globally, you see similar stories. In France, President Emmanuel Macron went from being celebrated as a centrist reformer to facing the massive Yellow Vest protests over fuel taxes and cost of living issues. The streets of Paris looked eerily similar to the Westminster scene. Angry chants, police barricades, and a leader accused of losing touch with ordinary people. In Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau faced his own wave of backlash during the trucker protests, where critics accused him of ignoring certain groups entirely. The point is, protests like the ones Starmer faced don't just happen in isolation. They often signal something deeper, a growing gap between the political class and the public. When leaders start making decisions with an eye on strategy rather than connection, it can backfire. What's interesting is that many leaders believe they're doing what's best for the country, but to the people on the ground, it feels like they're being sacrificed for some bigger political game. The big question now is, what can Starmer actually do to fix this mess? Because pretending it never happened will only make it worse. The first option is obvious. He could double down on his decisions and stick to his guns. That's the stay the course strategy. It's risky, but some leaders believe that showing no sign of backing down makes them look strong. The problem? It can also make them look stubborn and disconnected. If people already feel like you're not listening, refusing to budge just confirms their worst fears.
The second option is the complete opposite. Admit that mistakes were made, change course, and try to rebuild trust. This would mean rethinking the welfare cuts, adjusting the immigration policy, and opening up direct conversations with the communities who feel betrayed. It sounds good in theory, but in politics, admitting you were wrong can be dangerous. It gives your opponents ammo to say, "See, they didn't know what they were doing in the first place." Then there's the middle ground, tweaking policies without fully reversing them, and framing it as listening to feedback. This is the safest route for many politicians, because it lets them look responsive without looking weak. But here's the catch. If the changes are too small, people will see it as just another political trick, and the protests might get even louder. Beyond policy, Starmer has to think about communication. Right now, his image is of a leader walking past angry voters with his head down. That's not good optics. He could start doing more open Q&A sessions, town halls, or even unfiltered online live streams where people can ask him anything. Of course, that would mean facing some very tough questions in real time, but it might help break the image that he's unreachable. What do you think Starmer should do next? Let me know in the comments, and if you found this video interesting, hit that like button, subscribe, and check out our other videos for more stories like this.